The snow came early that year, sweeping over the Dakota plains like a ghost with nowhere left to go. It fell thick and unending, swallowing the fences, the trails, even the sounds of the world. In that white silence, a wagon creaked down a narrow road, its wheels groaning as if they knew the sorrow they carried. A young woman sat in the back, hands clasped over a single wool blanket, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the land blurred into the sky. Her name was Clara May Hensley, though her parents had begun calling her only the girl, as if saying her name cost too much breath. The man at the reins didn't speak. Elias Hensley's face was carved with frost and regret, but not the kind that stops a man's doing. His wife sat beside him, lips tight, her eyes never once turning toward the girl in the back. The silence between them was the kind that filled rooms and wagons alike, a silence that said everything. They were trading their daughter for survival. By the time they reached the Boone Ranch, the world was already dark. The house loomed on a hill, its windows flickering with lamplight like distant stars. A man waited at the gate, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick duster coat. Silas Boone. They said he was the richest man this side of the Black Hills, though he lived like someone who'd already buried his fortune. Elias stopped the wagon, clearing his throat. "She's strong," he said to Silas, avoiding Clara's eyes. "Knows how to keep a house, fetch water, milk, sew. You'll find her useful." Silas looked at her, and for a moment, the snow seemed to pause midair. His eyes were a pale gray, unreadable, the kind of eyes that saw everything but revealed nothing. He gave a single nod. Then, with a voice that sounded more like the wind than a man, he said, "There's food on the stove. Tobias will show her where to bed." No more was said, no handshake, no farewell. Elias climbed back onto the wagon beside his wife, and the horses turned, disappearing into the whiteness. Clara didn't move. She stood there, her breath misting in the cold, watching until the sound of the wheels faded to nothing. Only then did she realize her hands were trembling. The door of the house creaked open behind her. A stocky man with kind eyes, perhaps in his 50s, gave her a small nod. "Best come in, miss. Supper's near cold." Inside, the air smelled of smoke and leather. A single lamp burned on the table, throwing a circle of gold across the wooden floor. The fire crackled low, more ember than flame. Silas sat in the corner, mending a saddle strap with deliberate care, his shoulders hunched, face shadowed. Clara lowered her eyes and took the seat Tobias offered. The stew was thin but warm, and for that, she was grateful. No one spoke much. The wind outside howled through the chinks of the walls, a lonely sound that matched the rhythm of her heart. When she rose to wash her bowl, Silas's voice broke the silence. "You can take the small room by the kitchen. Door sticks, but it's warm enough." She nodded without meeting his gaze. The room was little more than a bed and a washstand, but the window looked out toward the valley, where moonlight turned the snow to silver. She undressed slowly, folding each garment with care, though she knew no one would notice. When she blew out the lamp, the darkness felt heavier than the blanket on her shoulders. She thought of her mother's parting words. "Don't embarrass us, Clara. You'll make a fine wife if you just keep quiet." The words burned colder than the winter air. Morning came pale and brittle. She rose before dawn, as habit demanded, and found the kitchen already alive with the scent of firewood and coffee. Silas was nowhere to be seen. Tobias nodded toward the barn. "He's out early. He keeps to himself, mostly. Best not to take it personal." Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The wind bit her cheeks sharp as truth. Beyond the barn, she saw Silas leading a horse through the snow, a dapple-gray mare with a limp. His movements were patient, almost tender, though his expression didn't change. Clara watched a moment before speaking. "She's favoring her left hind leg." Silas turned slightly, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You know horses?" "A little," she said softly. "We had one back home. Until we didn't." He said nothing more, but handed her the reins without hesitation. "Then you'll help me with her." It was the first time he'd looked her in the eye. They worked side by side that morning, their breaths forming small clouds in the cold air. The horse trembled, but Clara's voice calmed her, low and steady, like a hymn she'd forgotten she knew. When they finished, Silas said, "You've got a steady hand." It wasn't praise so much as recognition, but it was enough to warm her long after the fire went out that night. Days blurred into weeks. The snow thickened, turning fences into faint lines and the sky into a gray canvas. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch, the creak of the stable door, the crunch of ice under her boots, the soft nickering of horses when she entered the barn. She worked without complaint, her movements efficient and quiet. If she cried, it was only once, late at night. with her face buried in the pillow so the wind would carry the sound away. When she accompanied Silas into town for supplies, heads turned. She could feel their eyes like pins against her skin. The whispers began before they reached the general store. Boone's got himself a wife, they say. Bought her, more like. Hensley girl, plain as a fence post. Lord save her. Poor thing, Clara's spine stiffened. She pretended not to hear, but shame pressed hot beneath her collar. Silas didn't speak, didn't even look their way. He simply loaded the sacks of feed, handed her a small bundle of fabric she'd admired, and said, "You can make curtains if you like." His tone was flat, almost indifferent. But she saw the flicker of something softer beneath it. On the ride home, the sky turned violet with evening. Clara clutched the fabric in her lap, unsure whether to thank him. He spoke first. "You'll find the people here talk too much and think too little. Don't waste your heart on their noise." The words settled between them like falling snow, soft, quiet, unexpected. She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. That night, Clara dreamed of her old home. The creaking porch, the smell of bread baking, her mother's laughter before it soured into silence. She woke before dawn, heart aching, and went to the window. Outside, the ranch slept beneath a sheet of silver frost. For the first time, she wondered what Silas had lost to make him so silent. One afternoon, as she carried firewood to the shed, she heard voices inside. Tobias and Silas. Their tones were low but carried through the stillness. "She's been working hard," Tobias said. "Doesn't complain. You could show a bit of kindness." Silas's reply was rough, almost defensive. "She don't need my pity. Just a roof." The words hit like a blow. Clara stood motionless, the wood slipping from her grasp into the snow. For a long moment she couldn't breathe. Then she turned, walking away slowly, her steps leaving a clean line of prints behind her, a trail of proof that she'd once stood there, heard it all, and kept walking anyway. That evening, she ate alone in the kitchen, the ticking of the clock louder than any heartbeat. The stew was tasteless. Even the fire seemed reluctant to burn. Later, when the others slept, she stepped outside. The moon hung low and heavy, lighting the snow in shades of silver and sorrow. The cold stung her lungs, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was still alive. She looked out across the dark fields, her breath curling like smoke, and whispered to the night, "If I am to be unseen, then I will learn to see myself." The wind answered softly, carrying her words into the distance. She stood there until her hands went numb, the stars glimmering faintly overhead, the world silent but listening. Somewhere behind her, a curtain moved in the ranch house window, a brief flicker, as if someone had been watching. Inside, Silas Boone set down his lamp, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. For a moment, he almost called out to her, but the habit of silence was stronger than the impulse of care. He closed the curtain instead. In the snow outside, Clara turned back toward the house, the faintest light catching her face. There was a strange calm in her eyes now. Not resignation, but resolve. The wind rose again, and the old soul of the plains seemed to whisper through it, as if remembering her name for the first time. And though the winter night stretched endlessly around her, something within Clara May began quietly to thaw. The winter deepened until even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. Each morning bled gray and cold, the sky pressing low as if burdened by its own silence. Clara May had grown used to that silence, its weight, its slow rhythm. She filled it with small things. The steady scrape of a broom against the porch, the soft thud of wood split for kindling, the whistle of the kettle at dawn. Life on the Boone ranch moved without words, but in that quiet, something subtle had begun to shift. She noticed it first in the way Silas lingered at the table a little longer after supper, pretending to fix his gloves while his eyes stayed on her hands as she mended a tear in his coat, or in the way he began leaving small things in her path. A lantern trimmed and ready, a jar of wild honey set by her breakfast plate, a pair of warm gloves mended with care that did not match his usual rough indifference. He never said anything about them. She never asked. The gestures spoke a language she was only beginning to understand, one that relied not on words but on noticing. Tobias watched it all with quiet amusement. "The ranch feels different these days," he remarked once, his voice low as he repaired a harness. "Like the walls learned to breathe again." Clara smiled faintly, pretending not to understand, but a warmth rose in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. In town, however, the air was less kind. The gossip had not quieted. It had only grown sharper now that the snow trapped people together. On their next trip for supplies, whispers followed them like shadows. "Boone's keeping that plain girl like a hired hand," one woman said near the counter. Another replied, "He's lonely, not blind. He'll tire of her come spring." Clara kept her eyes on the shelf before her, pretending to read the label on a tin of sugar. Her hands trembled slightly, the paper rough beneath her fingers. When they left the store, Silas walked ahead without speaking. The silence stretched thin between them until, at the wagon, a man called out from the saloon porch, voice thick with drink and mockery. "Hey, Boone, you sellin' horses or buying women these days?" The world seemed to stop. The man's laughter echoed, ugly and hollow. Silas turned, slow and deliberate, his gray eyes cold as river stone. "You speak ill of her again," he said, voice low enough to cut the wind, "and you'll answer to me." No one moved. The drunk swallowed hard and turned away. Silas didn't look back as he climbed into the wagon. Clara followed in silence, her pulse fluttering beneath her ribs like a trapped bird. The road home was quiet, except for the creak of leather and the hiss of sleigh runners through snow. When they reached the hill above the ranch, she spoke softly. "You didn't have to do that." He didn't turn, didn't answer for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Maybe I did." Something in his tone, a weary honesty stripped of pride, settled into her bones like warmth after cold. She looked out over the white valley, where the ranch lights glowed faintly through the fog, and for the first time, the sight felt like home. The days that followed carried a new stillness. Not empty, but full of waiting. The air held a kind of fragile balance. When Silas entered a room, the space changed, the silence gentler now, less like distance and more like shared breath. They spoke little, but their small exchanges began to weave a pattern of understanding. One evening, as snow pressed softly against the windows, Clara found him in the barn, tending to Willow, the gray mare she'd helped heal weeks before. The lantern light caught in his hair, turning it gold at the edges. She stepped closer, holding out a folded blanket she'd stitched herself. "For her stall," she said quietly. Silas looked at the blanket, then at her, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Barely, but enough that it reached his eyes. "You've made this place gentler," he said. "Didn't think it needed that. Guess I was wrong." Clara felt the words move through her like a pulse, unexpected and real. She set the blanket down and busied herself brushing the mare, hiding the tremor in her hands. The next morning brought a wind so fierce it howled through the valley like something alive. Clouds rolled over the hills, dark and swollen. Tobias warned of a storm, but by nightfall it was worse than any of them expected. Snow lashed the windows, and the barn roof groaned under the weight of ice. Silas pulled on his coat. "The stock'll spook," he said. "I need to check the pens." Clara stood by the fire, heart pounding. "You shouldn't go alone. I've done it before." "Not like this," she said. The look she gave him stopped him in the doorway. For a heartbeat, the storm outside matched the one in her eyes. Fear tangled with something braver. He nodded once. "Stay by the light. I won't be long." But the minutes dragged into hours. The wind screamed, slamming against the walls. Clara paced the kitchen, unable to sit. Then, through the window, she saw it. A faint flickering glow near the barn, followed by darkness. She didn't think. She grabbed her cloak and ran into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall, slicing through the fabric, through her skin. The snow came in sheets, blinding, relentless. She called his name, but the wind stole the sound. When she reached the barn, the door hung open, half buried. Inside, the lantern lay shattered, the horses stamping in panic. Beneath a fallen beam, Silas lay still. Her heart stopped. She stumbled toward him, her hands clawing at the splintered wood. The weight was crushing, but she pushed, gasping, sobbing, until it shifted enough for him to breathe. "Silas," she whispered, brushing snow from his face. His eyes fluttered open, dazed. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured. "Neither should you," she said, her voice fierce through tears. "Now hush, we're going home." It took everything she had, the strength in her arms, the fire in her will, to pull him free. Together they half walked, half fell through the storm toward the house. Inside, she laid him by the fire, stripped off his frozen coat, and pressed a warm cloth to his brow. The flames caught his face in flickering light, hollowed but alive. For a long time neither spoke. The world outside was all wind and darkness, but here, in the trembling glow, time slowed. His hand found hers. "I thought I'd forgotten how to need someone," he said softly. "But I was wrong." She looked at him then, not the rancher who had bought her, not the man the town whispered about, but the soul beneath all that winter. "You didn't forget," she said. "You just stopped believing you could." The storm raged through the night, but inside something gentler took hold. When morning finally came, the world lay blanketed in new snow, the kind that softens everything it touches. Silas slept peacefully, his breathing steady. Clara watched him, her fingers resting lightly over his. The fire had burned low, but the warmth remained. By spring, the valley was green again. The rivers sang, and the horses grazed in fields of wildflowers. The townsfolk, who once whispered, now spoke with curious wonder. "Boone's place looks alive again," they said. "Never thought I'd see him smile." Clara rode into town one afternoon for supplies. The air smelled of thawing earth and lilacs. Miss Loretta from the store leaned on the counter, smiling. "Heard you've been tending that ranch like you were born to it," she said. "Boone's lucky, I'd say." Clara shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. Luck had little to do with it. She left with her basket, the bell above the door jingling softly behind her. Back at the ranch, Silas waited by the fence, mending a rail. When she approached, he looked up, eyes warm beneath the brim of his hat. "You were gone longer than usual," he said. "I wanted the long road back," she replied. "It's prettier when the wind isn't chasing me." He nodded, glancing toward the open field where the last traces of snow melted into earth. "You ever think about leaving?" She met his gaze and smiled, the kind of smile that reaches from the heart to the horizon. "Not anymore." The light shifted as the sun dipped low, painting the world in gold and rose. The ranch, once a place of ghosts, now hummed quietly with life. The crackle of the fire, the sound of horses, the laughter that sometimes slipped free between them when the days stretched long. An old soul might have said that love didn't arrive like thunder, but like the slow melt of ice, steady and certain, impossible to notice until the world was blooming again. Years later, the story would be told in the town's saloon and over hearths on cold nights, how the plain girl the Hensleys sold for survival became the woman who thawed a wintered heart. Some said Boone married her that spring. Others claimed he already had in spirit long before. But those who'd seen them together spoke only of how she looked at him, and how he never looked away, and somewhere, the wind over the plains carried their story, soft, enduring, like a memory half-whispered. "They said she was too plain to keep," the old voice would murmur to anyone willing to listen, but he saw in her the only face he needed forever. "Remember, traveler, beauty fades, gossip dies, but grace can turn even the coldest winter into spring." If this tale warmed a small corner of your heart, stay a while. There are more whispers waiting on the wind. Subscribe and hear the next one.